My husband's mom rewrote her will to exclude me, so I bought her house out. Some people lose their seat at the table quietly. Others realize they were never given one to begin with. I found out the day Eleanor Carter, my mother-in-law, leaned over her untouched salad at a family dinner and smiled as she announced her updated will. She said it in that crisp, deliberate way that wealthy women use when they want to sound casual but mean every word as a warning. "The new will keeps everything in the bloodline," she said, pausing to dab her lips with a linen napkin. "As it should be." Her eyes found mine across the table. I didn't say anything, not because I didn't understand what she meant, but because I understood all too well. My name is Gwen Stefani, not the singer, not a celebrity, just a 37-year-old financial strategist who thought marrying for love would be enough. I live in Newport, Rhode Island, a place known for its wind-battered cliffs and old money mansions. I met Logan Carter at an industry retreat hosted in a refurbished Naval Academy turned event hall. He worked in sustainable architecture, gentle-eyed and deliberate, far from the flash of the hedge fund types I usually consulted for. He carried a notebook instead of a business card and asked questions that made you pause. Logan wasn't just a good man. He was the kind of good that made you want to believe in shared futures, in homes filled with plants instead of plans. We fell in love over quiet dinners and long walks along the seawall, and when he proposed in the garden behind his family's estate. I said yes before he even opened the ring box. That house, its limestone columns, its ivy-covered east wing, the wide porch that wrapped like an arm around the ocean breeze, felt like a place you grew into, not just moved into. But from the beginning, Eleanor made sure I knew that love didn't automatically mean belonging. She greeted me with performative warmth, the kind laced with praise so pointed it could draw blood. A financial woman, how modern, she'd say, tilting her head just enough to signal amusement. I brought hydrangeas to our first family brunch. She said they reminded her of a funeral. I spent hours learning her favorite recipes for Logan's birthday. She told me I had a lovely way of interpreting classics. I was always almost enough, never quite. Still, I told myself that patience was currency. I smiled through veiled comparisons to Logan's ex, a daughter of a senator who wore pearls even when hiking. I let it go when she introduced me to her friends as Logan's modern wife with all the opinions at holidays. I watched as she guided seating charts with surgical precision, placing me just far enough from conversation, but close enough to witness every subtle signal of exclusion. For the first few years, Logan defended her, not harshly, but with the gentleness of someone raised to see family as unchangeable. "That's just how Mom is," he'd say. "She doesn't mean anything by it." When I pushed back about the way she talked over me, or corrected me on things I knew, I saw that flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Not disbelief, just weariness. And so, I backed down, again and again, until I barely recognized the version of myself who once led international merger negotiations without blinking. Then came the dinner, the will, the smile, and the line that landed like a quiet slap. "Everything remains in the bloodline." That phrase didn't just mean I wasn't family. It meant I had been actively removed, legally, deliberately. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. I poured myself another glass of wine and nodded as if she'd just announced a change in catering. But something settled in my chest that night, a stillness, heavy and cold, not rage, not yet, something closer to clarity. I didn't marry into wealth. I married into a legacy. There's a difference. Wealth can be shared. Legacy is guarded like a fortress. And in that moment, I realized I had spent nearly a decade trying to enter through the front door of a house that was always going to keep the locks changed behind me. She thought rewriting her will would shut the door for good. What she didn't know was that I had already started learning where the foundations were weakest. I didn't sleep much the night after Eleanor made her announcement. I lay in bed beside Logan, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above us, my hands resting on the same sheets I had picked out 3 years ago when we redesigned the master bedroom. It was a soft cream linen set, expensive but not extravagant, and somehow it felt too clean for the kind of thoughts that filled my mind that night. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. I was numb in a way that scared me more than rage ever could. I had spent nearly a decade trying to be part of a family that had no intention of claiming me, and now it was written into law. I wasn't just excluded emotionally, I was excluded structurally. When I asked Logan, days later, if he had known about the will, he didn't deny it. He paused, as if choosing between explanations, and finally said, "She mentioned she was making some adjustments. I didn't know the details, but I could see in his face that he had known enough to know I would be hurt, enough to know that if I ever found out, it would matter." He tried to hold my hand, but I pulled away gently, not out of spite but preservation. There are moments in a marriage when silence says more than comfort ever could. I started going into the office earlier and leaving later. My colleagues didn't ask questions. They assumed I was working on a new portfolio or restructuring client debt, which technically wasn't wrong. I buried myself in models and spreadsheets, comforted by formulas that obeyed logic. There's a strange kind of therapy in looking at distressed assets. You learn to see patterns others miss, cracks in value that are invisible on the surface, leverage hiding behind glossy valuations. It felt eerily familiar. At night, I began rereading old case studies I hadn't touched since grad school. Ones about succession laws and real estate control in legacy families. It was academic. At first, just something to ground myself. But the more I read, the more I understood how predictable this all had been. Families like the Carters protect legacy with precision. Outsiders aren't simply disliked, they're considered a threat. And threats are neutralized, not confronted. Eleanor didn't scream, she didn't insult. She rewrote paperwork and smiled through social events, cutting with politeness sharper than a blade. The will wasn't her beginning. It was her final move, a way to ensure I would never hold anything that bore the Carter name. No matter how many years I stood beside her son. It was Carla, my old mentor, and now a quiet friend who asked the right question one evening when I stayed too late at a conference networking lounge. We were seated in a quiet corner, a half-finished cocktail between us. And she said, "You do realize you're still letting her write your role in this family, don't you?" I didn't answer right away, because she was right. I had been reacting to everything Eleanor decided, playing defense in a game I hadn't even agreed to join. The first time I let the thought in, really let it sit, was on the ferry back from Jamestown. I had taken a half day, needed air, needed salt wind and space away from polished floors and antique portraits. The idea came quiet, but it stayed. What if I stopped playing by her rules altogether? What if I stopped trying to win her favor and started using the one thing I had that she couldn't control, knowledge? That night, I opened a blank document on my laptop and titled it Options. I didn't know what I was building. I just knew I couldn't keep asking for a seat in a room that wasn't designed for me. The page began to fill slowly. Trust structures, loan purchases, mortgage-backed claims. I wasn't planning revenge. I was trying to breathe. But the truth is, when someone corners you long enough, even breathing starts to look like rebellion. I wasn't ready to act yet, but something had shifted. I started researching things I never thought I'd apply personally. Public records on Carter properties, refinancing dates, equity liens. I created a burner LLC just to test feasibility. It felt absurd. Then it felt powerful. I didn't tell Logan, not because I wanted to deceive him, but because I wasn't sure yet if I was building an escape route or a new kind of entrance. What Eleanor didn't understand is that exclusion has a price, not just emotional, but structural. When you push someone far enough to prove their place, you give them no choice but to build one from scratch. And in my world, that building starts with numbers. In the weeks that followed, I began living two lives. On the surface, I was still the accommodating wife attending family brunches and smiling through tense conversations about heirloom preservation. I helped organize a charity gala Eleanor was chairing, sat through tastings for holiday menus she had already decided on, and even helped draft her estate's donation proposal for the local heritage trust. But underneath that polished calm, I was doing something entirely different. I was building a structure designed not to destroy her legacy, but to free myself from the shadow of it. Every evening, after Logan went to bed, I'd sit in the study with a second laptop, one registered to the LLC I had quietly formed under the name Eglinton Ridge Capital. It was a shell, but a legal one, fully registered in Delaware and fronted by a third-party agent service. I wasn't hiding to be unethical. I was protecting the process. In my world, anonymity in debt acquisition isn't unusual. It's strategic. My goal was simple. If the Carter estate was as over-leveraged as I suspected, I would find out and then offer terms that suited me. I started by pulling property records, which in Rhode Island are surprisingly public. I examined the original deed for the house, the tax records, the refinancing history, the liens. It took less than a week to confirm my instinct. Eleanor had refinanced the estate 3 times in 10 years, likely using equity to cover renovations, donations, and the maintenance of a lifestyle curated for image more than necessity. One of the loans had changed hands twice already and was currently held by a small regional bank. Coastal Heritage Trust. That was the opening I needed. I didn't make an offer right away. First, I assessed the debt, requested a valuation, and built a profile of comparable properties in the area. Every step was logged, reviewed, and processed like any other transaction I had handled professionally. The difference was this time. The investment wasn't just financial. It was personal. But I refused to let emotion interfere with legality. This had to be clean, defensible, and logical. The numbers had to speak before I did. Meanwhile, at home, Eleanor continued her gentle campaign of erasure. She began planning the family's annual winter portrait session and left me out of the initial email chain. When I asked about it, she said it had been an oversight. When I offered to help with guest management for the foundation's annual fundraiser, she told me she already had enough experienced hands. Every time she said we, I knew she didn't mean me, but I no longer felt anger. I felt distance, like watching someone fade behind glass. I was no longer trying to get closer. I was observing, calculating, and waiting. Logan noticed the shift, but not in the way you'd think. He said I seemed more focused lately, less reactive, more settled. He thought I was finally letting go of the tension between me and his mother. I didn't correct him. Part of me hated the silence, but part of me needed it. There is a cost to confrontation, and I wasn't ready to pay it yet. Not until I knew where every piece on the board stood. After 3 weeks of background work, I submitted a letter of interest to the bank holding the mortgage on the Carter estate. The language was standard expressions of curiosity about distressed portfolios, a request for documentation, an invitation to negotiate. The bank responded within 5 business days. They were open to discussions. The mortgage was technically current, but behind on projected tax adjustments. That gave me leverage. I knew how to push just enough to make acquisition appealing without making it look like pressure. The moment the official purchase agreement came through, my hands trembled. I wasn't afraid. I was awake for the first time in years. I was doing something not to be accepted, but to define my own worth. Owning the mortgage didn't give me ownership of the house, but it gave me control over the structure Eleanor had used to humiliate me. I was no longer waiting to be included in the Carter legacy. I was becoming the only person in the room with the authority to decide its next chapter. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even tell anyone. I saved the signed documents in an encrypted drive, closed the laptop, and walked downstairs to make dinner. Logan was reading on the couch, the golden light of late October sliding across the living room floor. He looked up and smiled. I smiled back. Not because everything was okay, but because I finally understood what it meant to stop asking for space in someone else's world. The bank's official notice reached Eleanor on a Tuesday morning, neatly printed on letterhead with language precise enough to confuse, but firm enough to alarm. It was delivered to the Carter estate like any routine correspondence, slipped in among charity event invitations and curated magazine subscriptions. Except this envelope carried something she hadn't expected, a shift in power. I wasn't there when she opened it, but I imagined the moment, the slow unraveling of the pages, her eyes scanning for signatures, realizing that Wilson Heritage Trust no longer held her mortgage. It now belonged to a company she had never heard of, a shell firm with a forgettable name but unignorable authority. By Wednesday afternoon, Logan came home with tension in his shoulders. He poured himself a drink and said his mother had called him 3 times in one day. She said the bank sold the mortgage to a private entity, and she's trying to get more information. He explained, still unaware. I stirred dinner without looking up and asked how she seemed. Worried. He replied, "She's never worried." I nodded and changed the subject. There would be time to tell him everything, but not yet. Not while he was still trying to protect both sides. That Saturday, Eleanor called for a family meeting. The language was urgent, but still dressed in civility. I need everyone present for a financial matter that affects the estate. She wrote, "This is not about conflict, it's about preservation." The word preservation made me smile. It was always about preserving something image, name, tradition, control. I said I would attend, and Logan seemed relieved. He still believed this would be resolved with polite discussion and reasoned compromise, but I already knew better. When we arrived, the house felt different. The staff was nervous. The living room was perfectly arranged, but lacked its usual curated elegance. Eleanor stood at the center, a file in her hands, her pearls slightly misaligned. That alone told me how shaken she was. She began speaking the moment the last family member entered, laying out the situation like a board meeting. The bank sold our mortgage to an entity I'm unfamiliar with. They've requested a formal conversation about missed payments and possible adjustments. I believe this was a predatory acquisition. Someone's targeting the Carter name. Logan's cousin Michael, who worked in real estate, asked how far behind she was. Her voice faltered slightly before she admitted the number, just over 180,000, including penalties. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The image of stability they had believed in was cracking, and the pressure of reality began to seep in. Ideas were thrown out: private loans, asset liquidations, asking the bank for extensions, but none of it addressed the truth. The estate was drowning in quiet debt, and the lifeline had already been bought. When the room fell into silence, I stood. "I'd like a private conversation with Eleanor," I said, careful to keep my voice steady. Her eyes narrowed. "There's nothing you can say to me that you can't say in front of family." She responded tightly. I smiled, not kindly. "Actually, I think you'll want privacy for this one." Her expression shifted, and she nodded once. We stepped into her study, a room lined with leather-bound volumes and portraits of people whose eyes all seemed to hold the same cold pride. I waited until she closed the door before opening my folder. I laid the documents on her desk without a word. She stared at them for a few seconds before recognition registered. Her jaw tightened. "You," she said softly, disbelief slowly turning to fury. "You bought my mortgage." I didn't answer. I just waited. She looked back at the pages. "This is fraud, manipulation. You've been planning this." I finally spoke. "No, Eleanor, I've been surviving this." She tried to regain control, lifting her chin and softening her tone. "Gwen, this house is our family's legacy. You've crossed a line." I nodded slowly. "And you crossed it when you erased me from your legacy while I was still setting your table and rewriting your budgets." Her voice dropped, dangerous and cold. "Logan will never forgive you for this." I kept my gaze level. Logan will decide for himself what forgiveness means. But I'm done waiting for permission to exist in a family I've been part of for nearly a decade. She reached for her phone. "I'm calling him." I nodded. "Do that, but I suggest you read the terms first." As she dialed, I turned and walked to the window, looking out over the backyard where I had once planted spring bulbs in silence, while she critiqued my choices. Behind me, her voice cracked, laced with disbelief. "He's coming. He needs to hear this in person." I said nothing. The woman who had always held the room with curated grace was now calling for help. But this time, she no longer held the power to decide what happened next. Logan arrived at the estate 20 minutes later. His tie was slightly loosened, his jacket thrown hastily over his shoulder, and his expression caught somewhere between confusion and unease. He greeted his mother first, as he always did, then turned to me with a question in his eyes that he didn't voice. Eleanor wasted no time. She launched into her version of the story with practiced rhythm, framing herself as the victim of a calculated ambush and me as a woman with a secret agenda. She spoke of betrayal, of legacy, of the Carter name being weaponized by someone who had never truly understood what it meant to be part of this family. When she finished, she turned to me with a performative sigh and said, "Tell him I'm lying. Gwen, tell him this isn't personal." I looked at Logan, whose gaze had drifted toward the floor, then slowly back up to me. I didn't hesitate. "Everything she said about the mortgage is true." I said, "What she's not saying is why it happened." I handed Logan a second copy of the documents, the same ones I had shown his mother. His hands were steady, but his breathing wasn't. "This isn't just a property," he said quietly. "It's where I grew up. Every memory I have." I nodded. "I know. And I respected that memory until the day I found out your mother legally ensured I would never be allowed to inherit even a broken light fixture in it, not because of our marriage, not because of anything I did wrong, but because I was never the daughter-in-law she wanted. He looked between us again. "You could have told me," he said, "before you bought the debt." "I thought about it," I replied, "but I knew it would place you in an impossible position, and I wasn't sure you were ready to see what I had been living through for 8 years. He didn't answer, and in that silence, I saw the weight of a man who had spent his life trying to please 2 women at war with each other without ever admitting the war was happening. Eleanor stepped in, her voice suddenly soft. "She's using your father's house as leverage. Logan, she wants control." I met her eyes. "No, I want dignity, something you've refused to give me from the moment I stepped into this family." Her face stiffened, but she said nothing. I turned back to Logan. "You don't have to choose between us, but I do need you to see this for what it is. I didn't marry into a family. I married into a structure where I was only welcome as long as I stayed invisible." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the bookshelf and ran his hand along the edge, stopping at a framed photo of his parents from their early years. Then he turned, shoulders tense, and said, "I need time." I nodded. "I'm not asking for a decision, but I'm no longer pretending." I left the study, passed by the dining room where the rest of the family still sat in confused silence, and drove home alone. For the next few days, Logan and I communicated only by text, logistics, mostly, bills, groceries, calendar reminders. I stayed in our apartment downtown while he returned to the estate for a few nights, presumably to process. Though part of me suspected Eleanor was using that time to tighten her grip, but something had changed. The Carter family no longer looked at me as the quiet outsider. They looked at me as someone they had underestimated. I had stopped asking to be seen, and in doing so, I had forced them to confront who I had always been. The backlash came swiftly. Patricia, one of Eleanor's closest allies and Logan's cousin, called me a social climber during a charity event. Others whispered that I had gone too far, that there were better ways to earn respect. But behind closed doors, I received messages I hadn't expected. Michael, Logan's brother, sent me a simple line. She did the same to Diane. "I just didn't have your courage." Kate, his younger sister, wrote, "Maybe this family needed to be shaken up." And a week later, even Logan's Aunt Elizabeth reached out. I stayed silent when it was my turn. She said, "Watching you has reminded me why that silence cost me more than I realized." I didn't answer all of them, not out of pride, but because I wasn't doing any of this for recognition. I had no desire to become the hero in a family drama that had treated me like a footnote. I was simply done being erased. And while Logan struggled with the shock of everything unfolding, I had already crossed the line between hoping things would change and ensuring they did. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was reclaiming authorship. The house she had used to exclude me was now under my terms. The debt she had hidden behind was now in my hands, and the respect I had once begged for, I no longer needed it from someone who had only ever offered it conditionally. 3 weeks passed before Logan came to see me in person again. He asked if I could meet him for coffee at the small cafe near his office, the one we used to go to before things turned into schedules and silences. When I walked in, he was already sitting at our usual table by the window, fingers wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup, eyes darker than I remembered. He looked up when I approached, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, quietly but clearly, "I've been talking to people. Michael, Kate, Aunt Elizabeth, even Carla. I nodded, but didn't interrupt. I didn't see it. He continued, "Not really. I thought it was just tension between you and my mom. But it was more than that. It always was." He looked down, then back up again. "I should have defended you sooner. I didn't say it, but I think he already knew that his silence had done more harm than Eleanor's words ever could." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter. "She's asking me to pressure you into reversing the deal. Said she'll sell the house to someone else if you don't back off. Said you're trying to humiliate her." I unfolded the letter and scanned the familiar language. Eleanor always used the same weapon, elegant phrasing wrapped around threats she didn't have the courage to say aloud. "She can't sell it to anyone else," I said, placing the letter aside, "not unless she pays off the entire mortgage, which we both know she can't do." Logan exhaled slowly. "I know. She's scared." I looked him in the eye. "And I don't care." He blinked, stunned by the calmness in my voice. "This isn't about punishing her, Logan. It's about not letting myself get erased." He nodded, and for the first time in weeks, there was no hesitation in his expression. "Then let's finish it," he said, "together." By the time the final negotiation meeting arrived, the air between us had shifted. We weren't exactly repaired, but we were aligned. We arrived at the Carter estate to find Eleanor waiting with her attorney, Bernard Lockwood, a man known for his theatrical posturing and overpriced watch collection. The meeting took place in the study, the same room where this new chapter had quietly begun. Logan sat beside me. Eleanor refused to look directly at either of us. The lawyer opened the conversation with forced civility, suggesting a compromise partial buyback, debt restructuring, anything to avoid a full transfer of title. I listened quietly until he finished, then slid a document across the desk. It was a market value purchase offer, already reviewed by 2 independent appraisers. "She can accept this," I said, "and walk away with dignity and cash, or we move forward with foreclosure, which will be public, drawn out, and considerably less beneficial." Eleanor stiffened. "You think you've won?" she said, her voice shaking, not from fear, but from fury barely restrained. "You think this makes you powerful?" I didn't answer her question. Instead, I responded with the only truth that mattered. I didn't do this to feel powerful. I did it to stop feeling invisible. For a moment, no one said anything. Then, with trembling hands, Eleanor signed the papers, not quickly, not gracefully, but thoroughly. The pen scratched across the page with the weight of 3 generations behind it, and I felt every inch of that resistance. But in the end, she signed. Afterward, she stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the unlit hearth like it might offer her the words she no longer had the strength to say. I thought she might turn around and finally explain herself, maybe even apologize. But she didn't. Instead, she muttered, "You'll never be one of us." "Gwen, no matter what the deed says, I stood too. That's fine, because I'm no longer asking to be." I walked out of the room with Logan behind me, the weight of 8 years settling not as burden, but closure. When the title officially transferred 2 weeks later, I didn't throw a party. I didn't post anything online. I just stood in the empty foyer of the house that had once been used to exclude me and ran my hand along the banister I had been told never to touch. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean, like something had finally been rinsed off me. Not anger, not bitterness, but that quiet layer of doubt that clings to you when you've spent too long trying to be enough for people who prefer you small. Logan and I stayed late that night, walking room to room, planning renovations that would strip away the museum feel and make the place something warmer, something ours. I asked him how he felt seeing the home this way, untethered from the past. He said, "It finally feels honest." The first morning after the keys were officially ours, I walked through the front door with nothing in my hands except a notebook and a quiet sense of clarity. The house felt unfamiliar without Eleanor's presence. Though the furniture and paintings hadn't moved an inch, the walls still carried her taste-heavy fabrics, ornate mirrors, framed black and white photographs of family members who looked like they had never smiled a day in their lives. But beneath the silence, there was a new kind of stillness, not the cold kind that follows a fight, but the kind that follows the closing of a chapter. I stood in the dining room, remembering the time she corrected my posture in front of her guests, reminding me with a smile that a Carter never slouches. I remembered the Thanksgiving when I brought my grandmother's sweet potato casserole, and she announced to the table that tradition shouldn't be tampered with. For years, I had absorbed those remarks like background noise, thinking that if I stayed gracious long enough, she'd eventually run out of reasons to exclude me. But exclusion wasn't a temporary mood. It was a language she had mastered long before I arrived. Logan came in a few minutes later with 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to me without a word. We had spoken more in the last week than we had in the past 6 months. But the words didn't always come easily. This process wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about rebuilding what was broken. It was about building something new, with fewer illusions. We sat in the parlor and made a list, not just of structural updates, but of the traditions we wanted to keep and the ones we were ready to let go. He suggested removing the formal dining table, the one where place settings had always followed unspoken rules about power and proximity. I suggested opening up the sunroom, replacing the velvet drapes with linen, letting in more light. We agreed to repaint the study, not because the walls were damaged, but because it had always felt like a room built to intimidate. I wanted it to be a space where people felt invited to speak for the first time. The house wasn't being managed, it was being lived in. The renovations began slowly. We didn't hire a designer. We brought in a local contractor and explained that we didn't want luxury upgrades. We wanted softness, flow, honesty. The marble floors stayed, but we added rugs from artists whose names weren't famous, but whose work felt like home. We removed several oil portraits and replaced them with photographs we had taken ourselves, landscapes, moments, pieces of life that had nothing to prove. In the upstairs hallway, I placed a small frame print of a lighthouse from my hometown. When Logan saw it, he didn't say anything. He just smiled and adjusted the frame slightly so it hung perfectly straight. Eleanor called once during that time. The conversation was short. She asked if she could retrieve a few heirlooms she had forgotten to pack. I said yes, but asked that she schedule a time with our lawyer to coordinate the pickup. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain. I didn't remind her of everything she had said or done. I had already chosen a different kind of closure, and it didn't include re-entering a cycle of quiet cruelty. Some people confuse access with entitlement, but she was no longer entitled to my response when she arrived. Logan stayed upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen. Her footsteps moved lightly through the house, careful not to disturb anything. I listened as her assistant packed a few crystal pieces and a monogrammed set of silverware. She left without saying goodbye. I didn't expect her to, and I didn't need her to. Some doors don't need slamming. They just need locking behind you. By the time spring arrived, the house looked different, not in dramatic ways, but in subtle ones that mattered. The rooms echoed less. The corners felt less sharp. We hosted our first gathering in April, a small brunch with friends and a few family members who had quietly supported us for the first time. I heard laughter in the drawing room that wasn't restrained by social cues or hierarchy. Kate brought her partner. Michael flew in with Diane. They helped us set the table, made jokes about how they'd never seen the house with sunlight streaming in. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't overthink anything. I just lived in that moment, knowing it was something we had earned, not something we had begged for. After everyone left, Logan and I stood in the garden, now blooming with new plants we'd chosen together. He turned to me and said, "It feels lighter, like we took something heavy off the foundation." I looked at him and nodded. That's because we stopped building on top of someone else's approval. It wasn't until months after the house was ours that I finally understood forgiveness was never going to look like what I thought. It didn't come in the form of an apology, or a handwritten note, or even a quiet admission over tea. It came in the quiet ways I started to reclaim myself, not for show, not for proof, but because the weight of needing validation had simply grown too heavy to carry one more year. That summer, I started gardening again. I hadn't touched soil since the early days of my marriage. When Eleanor had once stood over me while I planted tulip bulbs near the back fence, pointing out spacing flaws and reminding me that the family had preferred peonies for generations. Back then, I had nodded politely and dug deeper anyway. But over time, I'd stopped trying, stopped offering, stopped leaving traces of myself in spaces that weren't built to hold me. So when I found myself kneeling again in the same corner of the yard, pulling weeds from the roots and breathing in the damp earth, I knew something was changing, not because anyone allowed it, but because no one could deny it anymore. Eleanor had not spoken to us directly since the sale. She had moved into a penthouse downtown, close to the harbor, with concierge service and fewer stairs. Word reached us through distant relatives that she was adjusting, though not without the expected dramatics. Apparently, she referred to the estate as lost to legal trickery, conveniently ignoring the fact that the terms had been fair and the paperwork airtight. But I no longer needed her to tell the truth. I only needed to stop internalizing the lie. One day, Logan found a box in the attic labeled Guest China, Gwen. It was a collection of serving dishes I had brought to the estate in the first few years, ones that slowly disappeared after holiday meals, replaced by Eleanor's curated pieces. He handed it to me like he was offering back something I didn't even know I had lost. We unwrapped the plates together. None of them were broken, just buried, forgotten, like me. They had been tucked away to keep appearances neat. But now, I lined them up on open shelves in the kitchen, where they belonged, and I used them for Tuesday dinners, for slow mornings, for no reason at all. I began setting new boundaries with people who used to think I needed their approval to exist. Some were surprised, some were offended, but most simply backed away once they realized I wasn't bending anymore. The shift wasn't loud, it was consistent. Quiet refusal to shrink. I didn't explain myself. I just lived differently. That, more than anything, became the act of resistance I had been waiting for. Logan watched it unfold without interfering. He started attending therapy on his own, something I never asked him to do. He said he wanted to understand how he had learned to normalize silence, how he had learned to see discomfort as something to smooth over instead of confront. I respected that. We talked more honestly than we ever had. We admitted the ways we had both contributed to the quiet distance that had once filled our home. I told him how hard it had been to keep smiling while his mother chipped away at me in polite increments. He told me how helpless he'd felt watching it, but never knowing how to stop it. Neither of us cried. We just kept talking. Eventually, we decided not to sell the house. For a while, it had seemed like the logical thing to do, a clean break, a fresh start. But after walking through each room again, remembering not the hurt, but the choices we had made to reclaim it, we realized it had become something else. It was no longer a symbol of what we were denied. It was proof of what we had survived. The Carter estate no longer belonged to a legacy of silence. It belonged to a new kind of story, one that didn't need to be told with trophies or titles or photographs arranged by bloodline. Sometimes I still think about the years I spent trying to be chosen, how much energy I poured into being palatable, pleasant, proper, and how many pieces of myself I slowly tucked away to fit the mold of someone's idea of family. But now, when I walk down the hallway and see my own photographs on the wall, my own art in the corner, my own words scribbled on the family calendar, I remember that belonging isn't something you're given. It's something you claim when you decide you're enough as you are. The most surprising part, forgiveness didn't come with a dramatic conversation. It came in the stillness of knowing I didn't need anything from her anymore. Not a phone call, not a thank you, not a reversal of her will. I had stopped trying to be part of her version of family, and in doing so, I had finally created mine. The following winter, Eleanor had a minor stroke. It wasn't serious, but serious enough for the hospital to contact Logan as her emergency contact. He called me that evening from the parking garage, voice tired, unsure what he was even asking for. She's alone, her assistant's out of town. I don't know if she meant to reach for me or just didn't want to be alone with herself. I didn't say anything at first. Then I told him I'd go with him, not because I owed her anything, but because I needed to know for myself what had changed, if anything at all. When we arrived at the hospital the next morning, she was sitting up in bed, makeup lightly applied, silver hair perfectly brushed, posture almost too straight for someone recovering. She looked at me first, not down, not through, at me, and for a brief second, I saw something in her face that I hadn't seen in years, not affection, not even guilt, but pause, like she wasn't sure what version of me would walk into that room. I stepped forward calmly and placed a small journal on her bedside table, filled with basic recovery schedules and contact numbers. I told her the name of the nurse I'd spoken to and where her prescriptions would be filled. She said thank you. It didn't sound forced, but it didn't sound familiar either. After a few minutes, Logan stepped out to take a call, and we sat in silence. Then she said something I hadn't expected. Perhaps I was too protective of family tradition. I didn't reply. I just waited. She looked out the window for a long while before continuing. I wasn't raised to believe legacy could be shared, and I don't know if that was wrong, but I see now it cost me more than I thought. That was the closest she had ever come to admitting the truth. There was no apology, no full confession, but there was something even rarer, a fracture in the performance, a sliver of awareness. I stood, adjusted the blanket at the foot of her bed, and said, "Some things can't be repaired, but they can be left behind." She nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. I left the room without looking back, not because I was cold, but because there was nothing left in that room I needed to carry home. Logan and I didn't talk much in the car ride back, but when we pulled into the driveway, he reached for my hand and held it gently. Not out of guilt, not out of relief, just connection. A quiet understanding that what we had been through had changed both of us, and that there were some things neither of us would ever see the same again. We spent that winter finishing the last round of renovations on the estate, Logan reworked the guest wing into a creative studio. I redesigned the old drawing room into a small reading library, open to local women's groups and nonprofits. The kitchen, once ruled by silence and hierarchy, became a space for potlucks, community meetings, and warm, unstructured Sundays. The house was no longer just a symbol of power or lineage. It had become a place where people came not to impress, but to belong. Word spread slowly, as it always does in towns like ours. Some came out of curiosity, others returned out of respect. Even Kate brought a few friends from her volunteer group, whispering as she entered, "She never would have let us do this. You know that." Right, I did. And yet, here we were, making space for what had once been impossible. Occasionally, I would catch sight of one of Eleanor's antiques still hanging on a wall or stored neatly behind cabinet glass. I didn't remove them all. Some things aren't meant to be erased, just reframed. I kept the large oil painting in the foyer, not because I liked it, but because it reminded me of what had once defined the house and what no longer did. One afternoon, while reorganizing old files, I came across the original letter Eleanor had written to the family about the bloodline clause in her will. I read it one last time, then folded it gently and placed it in a drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder of how far I had come, of what it cost to stop asking for permission, of how dignity never comes from being included, but from deciding who you are even when no one else agrees. I never told anyone what Eleanor said in the hospital. It didn't matter. The truth wasn't in what she admitted. It was in what I no longer needed from her. And as spring thawed the ground again and tulips began to push their way through the soil I had planted months ago, I stood in the garden with my hands in the dirt, feeling not triumphant, not bitter, but free. 6 months after Eleanor left the house for the last time, Logan and I hosted a quiet dinner for a few friends and neighbors. Nothing extravagant, just good food, shared laughter, and the kind of warmth that never needed to be scheduled weeks in advance. It wasn't the kind of evening that made headlines or got posted online, but it was the kind of night that stayed with you after everyone went home. One of the guests, a woman from the local cooperative who had just gone through a divorce, looked around the room and said, "You can feel it. The house breathes easier now." I smiled and said nothing, but in my chest, something settled more deeply than it ever had before. That comment stayed with me the next morning as I sat alone on the front porch with my coffee, wrapped in a light sweater, watching the garden shift slowly into early summer. I thought back to who I was the first time I walked into this house, the nerves, the carefulness, the hope that maybe if I tried hard enough, I'd be allowed to belong. I thought about the years of being looked over, spoken around, and corrected with a smile, and how, for a long time, I told myself that keeping the peace was the same as being respected. It wasn't. Peace without self-worth is just quiet erasure. The most difficult part of this journey wasn't confronting Eleanor or restructuring the estate or even buying back my own dignity through a mortgage contract. It was recognizing how much of myself I had willingly dimmed to make other people more comfortable. The approval I spent years chasing came at the cost of my own clarity. That was the real loss. And now, that clarity is what I protect above everything else. Not out of fear, but out of knowing what it takes to rebuild it once it's gone. I won't pretend this story ended in some perfect redemption arc. Eleanor never fully softened. She didn't show up to any of our gatherings. Her version of the past never aligned with mine, and perhaps it never will. But the point was never about getting her to change. It was about no longer needing her permission to live without apology. And maybe that's what real growth looks like, not forcing someone to recognize your value, but knowing you never needed them to. Logan and I still talk about those years. Not often, but enough. He's grown in ways I wasn't sure he ever would. He no longer avoids conflict out of loyalty. He no longer shrinks when things get uncomfortable. We've had hard conversations about boundaries, trust, and what it means to stand next to someone without standing in their way. We've made new traditions, Sunday coffee in the garden, a shared journal we leave in the kitchen where we write notes instead of texts. Small rituals that don't carry the weight of legacy, but the comfort of being chosen. A few months ago, I was invited to speak at a women's business forum, not about finance, but about resilience. The topic felt ironic at first. I never saw myself as someone who overcame anything. I didn't win a lawsuit. I didn't dismantle a system. I didn't walk away with a trophy. I just stopped waiting to be invited and built my own place at the table. And maybe that's what quiet power looks like. The decision to stop knocking on locked doors and instead turn the key you were told you didn't have. As I stood at the podium that afternoon, looking out at a room full of women who had stories I would never fully know, I told them this sometimes. The most radical thing you can do is not fight harder, but walk away with your head high and your name still your own. You don't need to break someone else's house down to build your own. But you do have to stop believing they'll ever open the door if they've already decided you don't belong inside. Now, when I walk through this house, it no longer feels like a prize or a battleground. It feels like a mirror. It reflects the version of me who stayed quiet for too long, and the version of me who finally learned that being excluded isn't always a curse. Sometimes, it's the clearest invitation to come home to yourself. Have you ever had to stand up for your place in a space that tried to erase you? What would you do if the only way to be heard was to stop waiting and start building from scratch? Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched something in you, I hope you carry that feeling forward, not as anger, but as quiet proof that you are never invisible to the version of yourself who refuses to be forgotten.